How historically reliable is the Old Testament of the Bible? Many people these days think of the Old Testament as myth or legend, and I've heard people say there's no evidence at all for the events of the Old Testament before maybe 500 BC, the time of the Babylonian exile. Many skeptical scholars these days take a minimalist or super skeptical approach to the Bible, more skeptical than they are to other historical accounts. Let's investigate this question and look at some archaeological evidence. Archaeology is always changing as new artifacts are found and reevaluations of old ones are published. So I'll share some of what I'm aware of right now, and I'll update the supplement document if I hear of corrections that need to be made. Here's a timeline of the Bible with some key figures noted. Here's a more detailed timeline, which you can find on the internet. And here's a more simplified but partially detailed timeline, not to scale, focusing on the Old Testament. Let's break this up into a couple sections. So first we'll talk about the flood timeline and, of course, before the flood, and then we'll look at the other sections. So is there any evidence for the huge global flood that the Bible describes? Surprisingly, yes, there is a lot of evidence for a global flood. Please see my separate video on this very topic. Here's a couple. There's lots of marine and land fossils buried together in waterborne sediment layers all over the earth. There's rock layers that are bent while apparently still soft. There's marine layers pushed up into mountain ranges, polystrate trees indicating that the layers must have been laid down very quickly, much, much more. See, for example, a documentary, Is Genesis History, and Rise of Mountains. The websites creation.com, isgenesishistory.com, and so on. And see my little video series for more information. There are also dozens of flood legends from around the world in many cultures, with a few similarities between all of them. Most of the details are not as believable as the Bible. For example, the Epic of Gilgamesh says the ark was a cube shape, but that would not be a stable boat shape. It would tend to tip over in the high seas. The Bible's dimensions of the ark would in fact be stable in the waves. So check out more in the supplement. What about after the flood? The Bible says that after the flood landed in the mountains of Ararat, after the ark landed after the flood, there was a unified civilization that started, but then the nations split apart from each other at the Tower of Babel, along with the languages. From archaeological studies, there have been some huge towers or ziggurats excavated at Babylon and some other Mesopotamian cities like Eridu. The Tower of Babylon was estimated to be somewhere between 200 to 300 feet tall, although it may not have been completed. Meanwhile, recorded history for the oldest nations seems to be approximately starting at that same time. First, the Mesopotamian nations like Babylon, then Egypt, then Greece, about 150 years later. This time frame exactly matches the biblical timeline, which we can estimate from the genealogical dates given, putting Babel there. Also, recorded history from nations like Babylon, Egypt, and Greece seem to start between 2300 and 2200 BC, then seeing nations spread out, start their national histories depending on how far they are from Babylon. This is around the time of Peleg, Genesis 10:25. In his days the earth was divided, possibly around the time of what is called the Uruk expansion. The dating is controversial. Many secular scientists date these origins to before 3000 BC, but see my videos and the supplements for why radioisotope carbon-14 dating may be off, especially for dates before the 1400s BC. Also, linguists have compared various language families, and there seem to be a group of several language families which suddenly arose with no predecessor. They all arose historically around the same time, and as time went on, they only simplified in their grammar rules instead of becoming more complex. Finally, genetic comparisons on mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome DNA seem to show that geographical dispersion from Mesopotamia, the apparent broomstick shape of the genetic trees, imply long periods of small isolated populations, matching the biblical Babel account. For many years, scientists were talking about an out-of-Africa scenario, but in recent years, scientists are moving away from that, talking about multi-regional human population origins because of the genetic evidence. So I find it interesting that these four lines of evidence independently confirm the biblical account of the origin of nations after the flood. In the next video, we'll look at the patriarchal times, Abraham and his children.